This volume is part 1 of a 4-part Shadow series covering all facets of the Raven Queen, along with her most closely associated lore. In addition to the Shadowfell and the Plane of Shadow being covered today, you can find the Sorrowsworn, the Shadar-kai, and of course the Raven Queen herself, covered in parts 2, 3, and 4 respectively. Each of these companion videos will be published in that order to complete this September Shadow series. Links will be added in the show notes below as each volume becomes available. The Shadow Realm, the Land of Shadows, the Shadow Deep, the Dark Echo, and the Plane of Shadow. These are the many names for a singular plane of existence that has spanned the many cosmological models and versions of Dungeons & Dragons. And while the ever-shifting landscape of this atramentous plane has seen much evolution over the years, its most salient traits as an eerie realm of gloom, loss, and a variable connection to what lies beyond the mortal coil have remained mostly unchanged. In its current form, included as part of the 2 most recent texts of our lore, the 4th and 5th editions, it is called the Shadowfell, and its bleak expanse of desolation is not welcoming of visitors. Yet countless souls, the intrepid and foolish alike, fail to heed the warnings, songs, and fables that paint this grim inner plane as a realm where hopelessness anchors the soul with its suffocating grip, while unbearable grief and regret become a crown upon the frail mortal mind. Those who do emerge are forever changed by the experience, joining the chorus of cautionary tales serving censure that the Shadowfell is not for the living, and so the cycle repeats. Born from the remnants of its initial form as the Plane of Shadow and the magic of the Mistress of the Night, the dark goddess Shar, the Shadowfell is the dominion of grievous loss, desperation, and some level of death, decay, and every negative emotion that a mortal mind can foster. Here, along with its muted colors, the sounds are muffled and dissonant, and even time itself seems to flow differently. Introduced as part of the Points of Light and Nintir Vale setting of 4th edition, the current incarnation of the Shadowfell is not without its conflicts and even a fair amount of confusion. In fact, I think most veteran lore scholars out there would likely find some level of agreement on the statement that what we called the Plane of Shadow prior to the 4th edition and the Shadowfell since is a topic with a variable amount of self-contradicting lore, depending upon what cosmology holds the stars in the sky of your world. I also believe there exists a not insignificant number of people who simply think the Shadowfell is just a renamed and edgier version of that legacy plane, which would be inaccurate. And further, others still exist that likely dismiss the Shadowfell outright simply as a construct of the 4th edition, as the most unpopular and polarizing account of the Dungeons & Dragons mythos. My intent with this, the first of 4 companion videos, will be to clear the cloudy black waters of this lore quagmire. We will do so with the easier said than done formula that is to discover, compare, contrast, and then reconcile every shred of lore I can find, starting today with the Shadowfell and its progenitor, the Plane of Shadow. And if I have done my job with any level of success, then at the end of each video, you will have learned 1 or 2 things you may not have known previously, perhaps been mildly entertained, but most importantly, have all the related lore and my own personal recommendations to guide you in crafting narratives, adventures, or entire worlds that will best suit a wide range of player tastes across a myriad of tables. Okay, the portal won't be open for long, so jump in, and I hope you brought a few extra torches. The Shadowfell's darkness is unnaturally oppressive. Before the Shadowfell, there was the Plane of Shadow, in actuality a minor demi-plane originating but only briefly mentioned in the lore's 1st edition. While I will not claim to have done an exhaustive search on all 1st edition printed material, I was able to find references as early as 1980 in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition resource, Deities and Demigods. In that earliest of lore, the plane is said to be the result of an interaction between the positive and negative planes. Still, at this very early stage, the demiplane was scarcely more than a conceptual placeholder, more an idea rather than any form of a fully realized or accessible location for adventurers. Even 7 years later, with the release of the first Manual of the Planes for AD&D, the entirety of the lore took up only a single paragraph, although we did learn a bit more. Described as the largest of 4 demiplanes, which are defined as large, coalesced masses of protomatter that swirl about within the ethereal plane. Newer lore scholars may not have much familiarity with the ethereal plane, as the latter editions of the lore have not provided a ton of updates. But it is, in a cosmological sense, a foundational plane that provides the conduit of sorts between other planes of existence. It can be a bit confusing, and some conflate the ethereal plane with the astral plane, but they are separate. Often called the Sea of Mists for its sometimes colorful fog and always low visibility, the ethereal plane is a vast expanse that is divided into 2 separate domains, the border ethereal and the deep ethereal. But for the purposes of our discoveries today, just know that it's the space between spaces where demiplanes may form over time, and that it served as the cradle from which the plane of shadows was born. As the lore moved into the 2nd edition, our demiplane of shadow found an expanded role primarily as an abstract home to shadow creatures and as a source of power for shadow magic, telling us the plane was comprised of a substance called shadow stuff. The most relevant lore to the 2nd edition can be found another 8 years later, in early 1995 during the Planescape era. Within the pages of Dragon Magazine number 213, we find an article dedicated to the demiplane of shadow and are given a significant update, imbuing the plane with terrain that begins to mirror the mortal world, the concept of dark and alien-like creatures that inhabit the realm, and most importantly, the confirmation that adventurers may find means to travel to and upon its highly dangerous lands through planar spells and devices, as well as a suggestion that a portal may even exist in Sigil, the City of Doors, of course. These 2nd edition enhancements were definitely a step in the right direction. However, the plane still lacked any form of distinct ecology, notable locations, or any significant role or interaction with the material world. The foundational bones were definitely laid, but there was really no reason to travel there outside of creative homebrew works of dungeon masters and world builders. With the 3rd edition, I find myself again repeating one of the more common, maybe even redundant phrases uttered while sharing these lore volumes with you when I say, all that changed with the 3rd edition. I think sometimes even the 3rd edition cheerleaders like myself forget just how much lore was introduced and refined in 3E, one of the reasons the 3 and 3.5 versions of the game are still so beloved by many more than 20 years later. But setting my shameless bias aside, the 3rd edition lore, specifically the Manual of the Planes resource, built strongly upon the 2E updates to provide the most prominent enhancements to the Plane of Shadow, where we learn a lot of new details. No longer a demi-plane, the Plane of Shadow is now all grown up and broken free of the incubating ethereal plane to become a coterminous and highly morphic plane of existence. The former is what allows the fully formed Plane of Shadow to now be used to visit other realities, and the latter is a clever design choice to ensure that any mortal mapping of its surfaces will have a very limited shelf life, becoming more and more unrecognizable from the moment pen leaves parchment. The plane's morphic nature means its geography is in a perpetual state of motion and change, its lands shifting over time, just like our own Earth, but at a much accelerated rate. However, the lore goes so far as to suggest this may be just a temporary state and one that could potentially be controlled were a powerful entity or deity ever to exert its own influence upon the realm. This is both a great example of excellent design and foresight to set up organic, low to non-retcon changes in future versions, as well as illustrating a solid indictment that few, if any, of these 3rd edition authors were present or had influence in the 4th edition. The 3rd edition also provides additive lore to layer context on the foundation established in the 2nd edition. This includes further details on the plane as a dark echo of the material plane, the plane's effect on magic and light sources, new means of access and movement through use of the Shadow Walk spell, as well as referencing the presence of a range of inhabitants, including entire kingdoms, settlements, and cities. While we're not given much in terms of any specifics, this is still the type of bedrock lore that would open the door to future updates to make this formerly unapproachable realm something more tangible and useful for adventuring and world building. And finally, the 3E written texts provide canonical hints for an intrinsic characteristic that would carry forward as the plane evolved into the Shadowfell. And it is that inevitable fact that the plane of shadow and now the Shadowfell are toxic to non-natives. Not the poisonous gas type of toxic, but closer to, say, microplastics in our world. Over time, the Shadowfell will penetrate and infuse its essence into all living beings, introducing unpredictable vulnerabilities, physical changes to form, mental anomalies, and even new abilities. These mutations would come to serve as the genesis and canonical lore, allowing a seamless inception of new and variant Shadowfell monsters, creatures, and races in use today. And I really think the importance of this single sentence of lore cannot be overstated. As we progress into the remaining 3 volumes of this Shadow series, there are a lot of changes to not just the Shadowfell, but the Sorrowsworn and the Shadar-kai, just to name 2, but who each will see massive changes that, in my opinion, without this prescient lore, would look and feel contrived. However, thanks to these few words of foresight, future interpretations of this plane would be able to use this lore as a logical mechanic that accommodates such transformations by an intrinsic trait of this shadowy plane established over 20 years ago. And in fact, that is exactly what the 4th edition Shadowfell would do. They call it the Darkening. The 3rd edition would mark a significant turning point in the plane's history, no longer a conceptual domain intended for abstract storytelling, or as a monster-generating but detached demiplane. The plane of shadow evolved from its less significant origins into a fully grown and interactive element of the cosmology, setting the stage for future enhancements and technically also signaling its own end. The 4th edition is the origin and demarcation of the most significant changes we'll see in the plane of shadow, now transformed into the Shadowfell, introduced along with its parallel and polar opposite sister plane of existence, the Feywild. In-game lore tells us this all took place in the Year of Blue Fire, 1385 Dale Reckoning, as Shar, the Dark Goddess, through her own sinister plot and use of Cyric the Mad God, killed Mystra in what is her... well, let's see, just a second, some napkin math. She saves the weave after the idiot Crassus, so that's 1. She thought she was exempt from Lord Ao's mandate in the time of troubles, so Helm killed her. Reborn as Midnight, okay, that's 2. And then murdered by Cyric. Yep, okay, 3. That brings us to Mystra 3.0, I think. 4.0? It matters little, although I'm compelled to say that after a 3rd death of the Mother of Magic, who is, kind of a big deal what with the spellweave and all, maybe a full-time bodyguard should at least be considered? But I digress. Her death as it would happen would lead to everyone's favorite event, the Spell Plague. While I will save my derision for a catastrophe both in-game and out for another time, one of the many outcomes of the Spell Plague was Shar's creation of this new inner plane, birthed from merging the plane of shadows with the negative energy plane and then absorbing the dark echo of the material plane, as well as the many demi-planes of dread, which are better known as the collection of realms that include the Ravenloft setting. All coalescing into a new, evolved form of dark, energetic gloom that is the Shadowfell. But this is not just a change in name only. This is a new plane, now presented with some distinct visual traits that clearly tell us this is no longer our father's plane of shadow. First, the Shadowfell, unlike its earliest forms, is no longer a monochromatic realm devoid of any rainbow hues. While the realm is certainly one of gloom with its color continually being leached away, the tints are present in their muted and dullest of forms. Along these same lines of change, the Shadowfell no longer is caught in never-ending twilight, bereft of sun or star, as was often canon in earlier lore. In fact, the 4E lore tells us that the Shadowfell has a full day-night cycle, illuminated by the dull orange glow of a pale sun. However, this harvest star never rises much above the horizon and is most often cloaked in dark gray clouds, all of which indicate its weakness, having no ability to provide even the most minimal of warmth to the frigid realm. As hinted at in previous lore, magic in the Shadowfell operates under very different rules, amplified or diminished by one of the more unique properties of this new plane. Called the Shadow Weave, this magic type originated from Shar as part of the Shadowfell's creation. As one might guess, necromantic, illusion, and even enhancement magic are generally found to be stronger, while spells that generate light or control weather and plant life are weaker. Fire-based spells in particular have had conflicting reports of greatly diminished effectiveness, with their heat and light both being drained by the oppressive realm. True to form, this reimagined Plane of Shadows brought with it many changes, but the most dramatic are yet to come. In creating the Shadowfell, this reimagined plane of existence, along with its twisted twin, the Feywild, were resettled back into the ethereal plane that cradled its birth, thus positioning both planes in closer proximity to the material plane. This placement represents a shift towards a more accessible domain and continues the trend started in the 3rd edition of creating a less distant, obscure plane in favor of a more distinct realm with a parallel and tangible connection, supporting the Shadowfell's increased interactions with the material plane and, more importantly, the mortals that live upon it. The result of this indicates that through a myriad of arcane and intrinsic means, one might find areas of the Shadowfell bleeding into the fabric of the material plane and allowing for potential travel between these worlds. This could be accomplished with powerful magic, shadow passage rituals, planar portals, and most interesting, innate but tenuous connections to the mortal world known as shadow crossings. You could say that it has never been easier to reach this ominous plane of existence, not that you should feel encouraged to do so, or that it is any less dangerous. Still, successful expeditions to reach the Shadowfell may be easier, but that doesn't mean they're easy or even safe. The shadow crossings, for example, are often found only in places where tragedy or loss have occurred, drawing the essence of those somber events to narrow the barriers between the planes, and thus creating a bridge to traverse the two realms. Compounding this already difficult search to locate these bridges manifesting through the power of such negative emotion, it is rumored that even with the prerequisite air of tragedy and loss being met, these crossings will only appear whenever the sun is hidden behind clouds or the cloak of night, just another reminder of the threatening nature inherent to this domain. But if you do happen to find your way into the Shadowfell, it won't take long to recognize its inextricable link to the world from which you arrived. In this capacity, the Shadowfell fully embraces its cosmological role as the dark, unholy reflection of mortal reality, where familiar, mirrored landmarks take on what can at best be called a flawed and perverse copy. Where a massive mountain range fills a horizon on the material plane with its majestic beauty, the Shadowfell might manifest as a range of scorched peaks where erupting volcanoes rain fire upon the surrounding lands and fill the sky with its thick black sulfur and ash. A crystal-clear lake of tranquility with sparkling blue waters reflecting the serene colors of its surroundings now manifests in the Shadowfell as a stagnant swamp of black oily waters, its surface covered with a thick hazy film as it ripples with the unseen horrors lurking below. It is a darker, colder echo that twists and fractures all the aspects of mortal life that make it worth living. The wondrous colors of nature, the sounds of joy and laughter, and the warmth of a brilliant sun upon your skin are all bled away, drifting into a void of icy shadows, leaving everything tinted in the darker hues of the spectrum and bathed in what little muted light can break the hold of eternal storm clouds. Every facet of the Shadowfell offers veiled clues, deciphered by only the wise, but they are a caution, subtle warnings that there are perhaps better places for brave heroes to adventure. One of many distinguishing aspects of the Shadowfell is the continued expansion of the plane's ever-changing nature I outlined in Chapter 2, and its evolution as a dark echo of the material plane laid out in the 3rd edition and covered in Chapter 3. In addition to its terrain shifts and environmental changes, the plane is now also influenced by the mortal actions and emotions of its material twin, particularly those associated with negative emotions, including, but certainly not limited to, rage, malice, greed, hate, and even despair. This means the Shadowfell is susceptible to deeds of great evil such as wars, plagues, as well as extreme individual acts of hubris, corruption, and destruction from powerful forces on the mortal realm. Each of these malevolent affairs leave their own scars upon the Shadowfell. And it is this new canonical lore that transforms these scars into insidious pockets of dark power, regions of swirling negative energy that slowly suffuse across the realm, where they eventually formulate their own entirely new demi-planes, also known as the Domains of Dread. This lore is intended to expand upon what I alluded in the last chapter. Shar, when creating the Shadowfell, absorbed the well-established Domains of Dread, folding each into their own sinister region, now shrouded in a thick wall of mist and ruled by a mighty Dark Lord who holds absolute power and undue influence over that domain. And as all who have previously adventured in Barovia well know, any being that breaches that veil of mist becomes its trapped and unwelcomed guest. Your escape from the domain's grasp is rarely trivial, ranging from asking nicely, a tactic which I have found zero success with, to performing some deadly negotiated task for the Dark Lord, or perhaps even retiring his or her rule by any means necessary. I have taken the most scenic of routes to simply state that the Shadowfell is now the retconned home for all the Domains of Dread. And while this of course includes the most famous among them, Barovia, home of the first and much-loved vampire Strahd von Zarovich, as part of the Ravenloft setting, which, now that I'm thinking about it, absolutely should have already gotten its own video by now, note to self. But there are also many others. Darkon, formerly ruled by the Dark Lord Lich King, but now a crumbling domain slowly being reclaimed by those very mists. Har Akir, the domain of the ancient dead, ruled by the Dark Lord Pharaoh Angtepa. Morden, the domain of haunting spirits, or one of my personal favorites, the vastly underrated wandering domain, simply called the Carnival. And that's just the tip of a horror-themed iceberg, as there are almost 40 in the 5e resource Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft alone. Shar's act of absorbing the Domains of Dread into the Shadowfell also had the inherent byproduct of bringing with it the Vistani, a nomadic people renowned for their evil eye curses, who now inhabit this plane of shadow. Known for their bright clothing, mysterious rituals, and dark dealings, they can be found wandering the plane, their caravans moving freely across the dreary terrain. But now that I've threatened to take this volume down a Ravenloft-only rabbit hole, let me course correct by profiling the Shadowfell's new and expanded roster, a myriad of beings that a stalwart group of explorers might seek out, or be sought by, during their own travels upon this dark mirror of shadows and unknowns. Once crossing into the Shadowfell, it will not take long for one to unveil its macabre host of dark inhabitants, from humanoid races to full-on monsters, each exist in forms twisted by the weighty influence of the plane's penetrating despair and its innate power to mutate, known as the Darkening. Among them, the Death Giants stalk across the blighted lands and crumbled ruins as a marching billboard of the realm's grim finality. Once warriors of renown, they've been reshaped, transformed into hulking specters of their former selves. Not themselves undead, but bound to undeath. Their hollow eyes burn with cold hate as the soul hunters of the Shadowfell. Friendly advice would offer caution in the reach of extended shadows, as lurking within may be the ambush-savvy measles, gaunt and wretched beings whose only joy come in using their wire garrotes on unsuspecting travelers. Murderous creatures, they hunt the living with the aim of dragging their prey into the plane's depths to extinguish life, another light snuffed out, lost to the domain's eternal night. Then there are the Dark Ones, a roguish race of variant creepers and stalkers who live in the darkest corners of the realm and despise the light, avoiding it at all costs. These craven, backstabbing creatures favor the Shadowfell as well as the Underdark, where they are leveraged by greater powers on both planes as assassins and spies, slipping easily between both worlds with a depraved alacrity. And if these humanoids of the Shadowfell don't rattle you, let me introduce you to the true monsters of the plane. Meet the Dark Mantles, inky black cephalopod-looking creatures that hang silently from the ceilings of caverns, resembling living stalactites, only to drop on their prey and suffocate them in darkness. There are the six-tentacled aberrations known as Balhanoths, weighing almost 2 tons with a psionic ability to manipulate the reality around them. They can sense magic and are always looking to ensnare the minds of migrant explorers. You might even be unlucky enough to stumble upon a shadow dragon lair, a showcase of the plane's ability to transform with that darkening mutation. These serpents of night hoard fear and consume hope. Their shimmering scales absorb any scarce light around them. They exude an aura of dread, draining the vitality of any who dare approach, and are rumored to possess a level of intelligence to rival any red or gold variant of their kind. Yet the most harrowing of all might be the Nightwalkers, towering undead forms of nightmare fuel, often eclipsing 20 feet in height and radiating the very void itself. Born of the ancient malice of mortal will, these challenge rating 20 shades are wreathed in both negative energy and the shadow stuff from which the Shadowfell originates. To find yourself in its imposing presence is the sure erasure of light and life, leaving behind only the remnant and fractured memories of terror as you trade in your living form to take on a forever role as a servant undead, likely in the form of a Bodak. Nightwalkers are perhaps the most abrupt reminder that in the Shadowfell, death is not the end you will inevitably wish for, but a transformation into something infinitely darker. There are, of course, 2 more denizens of the Shadowfell I've yet to mention. The Raven Queen's 4th edition reign also heralded the arrival of 2 new creature variants twisted by the plane's mutating essence, and each tied directly to and serving the goddess of death. The Sorrowsworn, once Tanaree fiends of the abyss, became not 1 but 2 separate variant species, reformed and reborn as creatures of shadow and grief, and eventually taking on monstrous forms reflecting a specific and varied negative emotion. They first served the Raven Queen as the guardians, enforcers, and even bounty hunters of her will, and still roam the plane today, although their new purpose is a bit more complex and will be covered in part 2 of this series. There also exists the variant Shadar-kai, who share heritage with their Shadow Fae cousins, now evolved through the darkening into a distinct subrace of elves whose souls are bound in servitude to the Raven Queen even to this day. These elves, while still possessing a haunting grace and beauty, were forever marked by the plane's mournful qualities. There is a lot more to share on the Sorrowsworn and the Shadar-kai, so each are receiving their own dedicated volumes that I hope you'll check out. The Shadowfell of the 4th edition, as introduced to the Points of Light setting, was a realm dominated by death and decay, fitting given its design intent to fill a primary role in the passage of mortal souls and the fate of their subsequent afterlife. At the center of this new Shadowfell lore, sitting in judgment of mortal souls and safeguarding that afterlife from the vile blasphemy of undeath, was the newly deified goddess of death, the always mysterious Raven Queen. We will provide a full and complete profile covering the duality of this highly conflicted entity in Part 4 of this Shadow series, but it's worth mentioning here that in her genesis, the Raven Queen presided over the domains of death, fate, and winter. In support of her newly minted role, the Shadowfell became the destination for drifting souls on their journey to a region known as Lurks, where the Raven Queen ruled from a black ice citadel known as Fate's Palace. Some souls lingered there waiting for their decreed fate, a verdict to be passed down by the goddess of death before moving on to their final destination. Still others found this region to be a form of purgatory, lost souls trapped and wandering the bleak fallow. Lurks, a liminal state where the veil between life and death was razor thin, made an ideal hunting ground for necromancers, death knights, and other beings seeking to harness the power of the dead or steal wayward souls, but did so with the full knowledge that the Raven Queen and her agents despised the practice of undeath. Now, the lore is insistent that I tell you that the Shadowfell itself, while undeniably triggering all the senses and warning lights to say otherwise, is not, and really never has been, a plane of evil. I see this in the written literature, and I hear it repeated incessantly by other scholars, and maybe on some technical merit by an arbitrary letter of the law standard, you could prove this to rest somewhere on the spectrum of truth. However, I have no wish to lead any courageous explorer or intrepid adventurer astray because I parrot some irresponsible mantra apparently written from the Shadowfell Bureau of Travel. So let me leave no doubt that whether the plane itself is evil, which I personally find to be a ridiculous statement in and of itself, the Shadowfell was created by Shar, an evil-aligned goddess, in the wake of her killing the lawful greater goddess of magic, Mystra. And the fallout to such a villainous act of evil as murdering another god was the calamity known as the Spell Plague. It is undeniably a dangerous plane where the undead and Shadowborn exponentially outnumber the living, and you would be hard-pressed to find anyone to contest that an abundance of evil, in many forms, most certainly exists within its borders. Evil is indigenous to its inhabitants, and evil creatures are both morphed into and spawned from nothing more than the perverse negative energy and emotion that flood this realm. And while I have never seen a unicorn or silver dragon born from its shadows, I have seen legions of evil to the core horrors and about every nightmare form possible emerge from its inky blackness. So the lore can tell us the Shadowfell is itself not evil all at once, but given the sheer amount of evil that is waiting on your arrival and around every corner, I feel compelled to tell you that if it walks like a duck, well, you know the rest. With much of the Raven Queen's role being walked back in the lore's 5th edition, the Shadowfell too would evolve and morph as it always has, as it always will, ever-changing, reflecting the influence of the realm's most powerful entities. And while it remains a realm of shadow, sorrow, and even death to a more limited degree, it exists today as a more nuanced and diverse realm. While the 5th edition Raven Queen remains in the Shadowfell, the extent of her rule over the entire plane is now far more uncertain, and the plane now resonates with a deeper connection to memory, loss, and those negative emotions. And while the Shadowfell cannot escape its association with death any more than it can evil, after all, this is and always will be a domain where the darkest of powers, including death, have a home field advantage and more often than not seem to find an upper hand. In reality, though, this 5e plane of shadow is more a dominion of oppression and negative amplification, a realm where the mortal mind becomes shattered, its memories fragmented, and mortal life and vitality are leached away, all while thoughts and emotions slowly turn negative. heavy and overwhelming, leaving their stench and a residue of deprivation on everything. And for those that remain too long, it is never a question of if, only when. The Shadowfell will manifest its sinister resolve, exerting its dominating influence as the weighty condemnation of shame, grief, regret, and loss, and leaving only hopelessness and desperation that grasp at the mind and soul of the living. If after everything revealed today you are still bound and determined to cross into the shadows, then you had better at least know a few of the locations and points of interest that exist within its borders. But before I share the few known locations, a word to the wise for dungeon masters, world builders, and players. We must remember that the Shadowfell is almost completely unmapped, yet we know the plane mirrors in many ways the material plane. That leaves a near infinite amount of empty space and unclaimed land. I would hazard to guess that the percentage of the Shadowfell that has been navigated, where the explorers live to tell of their journeys, to fall in the low single digits. This means that while canonically there are only limited points of interest, one can reasonably assume that there are likely hundreds, maybe even thousands of hamlets, villages, cities, and even entire kingdoms scattered across its lands, not to mention dungeons, castles, and lairs to adventure within. Each of these settlements is unknown, unmapped, and many of them have as many taverns, merchant shops, and whatever else a traveler might need as the dungeon master so desires. So keep that in mind as I share what little canonical material we have. The Shadowfell is a homebrew playground for building, a proverbial blank canvas. In fact, I just convinced myself that my next Patreon Dungeon Master's resource will be some of my own world building in the Shadowfell. So look for that in the shop if you'd like some cool adventuring locales in the Plane of Shadow. Okay, but let's cover what we do have in terms of points of interest. Not exactly a haven of virtue and light, but Gloomrot might be your only decent hope of restocking supplies or grabbing a mead and a meal within the muted hues of the Shadowfell. Gloomrot definitely lives up to its name as a place of somber grandeur and persistent grief. And this ever-changing port city thrives as the rare beacon of life amidst the Shadowfell's overwhelming blight. Here you'll find the streets alive with whispers and secrets, its twisting alleys home to the sinister and the desperate alike. The city's architecture reflects the bleakness of the plane, its buildings sculpted from shadows with shifting forms and illusory facades that reflect the ever-changing nature of the plane. Serving as the primary hub for planar trade, especially in goods of a necrotic nature, Gloomrot operates more as a lawless domain of shady merchants, villainous criminals, and of course the Shadar-kai, who frequently stalk its darkened alleys, seeking to fulfill the mysterious whims of the Raven Queen. A picture of Catonic indifference, Prince Roland the Deathless governs in name only, but true power rests with the Keepers, a mysterious, shape-shifting cabal who control the city to feed on the misery and woe they foster. Rumors even suggest that the Keepers built the city with their own blackened hands. You may not find much law and order in Gloomrot, but it is often the best place to find the kind of essentials one may need when traversing through the Plane of Shadow. Coming to prominence during the Raven Queen's reign as the goddess of death, I just want to mention the Lost River, which is, or perhaps was, a spectral stream winding across the Shadowfell. Its silver-tinted ethereal currents were visible only when the boundary between worlds was thin. But upon closer inspection, you would see your eyes were merely playing tricks on you, because the Lost River is actually the channeled flow of souls said to be making their way to Fate's palace for final judgment. The Lost River was a rare sight even under the Raven Queen's rule, so one is left to wonder if this river of souls still exists, although even if it does, it is likely just crossing through on the way to the Fugue Plane, where the 5e written texts have confirmed souls are now judged by Kellumbor. Evernight shimmers as the grim reflection of the city of Neverwinter, but it is most unwelcoming to the living. It is a city overrun and controlled by the undead and those who traffic with the undead, necromancers, slave traders, and dark cultists, among others. There's not much here for those still drawing breath. The city's architecture consists of decrepit ruins, the cobblestone streets topped with thick layers of moistened grave soil, and its skies are forever shrouded in ashen clouds, now tinted a dull necrotic green. Governed, for lack of a better word, by a caste of intelligent ghouls, they rule from the House of Screams. And Evernight is a place where the living are merely another commodity. They are traded and consumed to sate the hunger of the city's undead populace. You may recall my mention of the Shadow Crossings in Chapter 4, these negative energy portals that bridge the gaps between these two worlds. Neverwinter and Evernight do share one such connection. They're called Crevices of Dusk, and while they do allow for a disturbing ease of travel between Neverwinter and this, its dismal undead echo, they have in recent times become undead beacons in Evernight for hordes of hungry undead waiting on their next meal. Just something to keep in mind should you, in a suicidal fit of madness, decide to use one of these to visit this kingdom of the grave. While there is little doubt that the Plane of Shadow's evolution into the Shadowfell of today was performed in support of the 4th edition's Points of Light setting, I think I've made a strong case today and will continue to do so as we work through this 4-part Shadow series, that whether by design or accident, this reimagined Plane of Shadow does offer a more compelling narrative, increased world-building opportunities, and is even now well integrated into a 5th edition that stripped away from not only the 4th edition setting, but also the world axis cosmology. The Shadowfell is now a realm of adventuring potential, where the rules of life and death are distorted and a heavy drain on the living is an ever-present challenge. And whether leveraged as a mere sojourn in your adventures or the starring role of a campaign, the Shadowfell can enhance any table and world with deep narrative layers, challenges, and unknowns. And that completes Part 1 of our 4-part Shadow series. Next up in Part 2, we will profile the Sorrowsworn, terrible monstrosities of the Shadowfell who have some confusing but yet very interesting lore that I am very much looking forward to sharing with each of you. A special thank you to my YouTube channel members and my supporters over on Patreon who both make this video possible. If you'd like to support my work, it's a win-win by joining my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of DM and world-building resources, adventure packs, 4K art packs, early audio access, a complete hierarchy of the 9 hells, and much more, including that Shadowfell supplement that I just mentioned. I was serious about that. I'm going to be working on it all this week. So check it out over on my Patreon. Join for free with no obligation. At the very least, it's a great way for me to interact with each of you. Links below. And finally, if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. And until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.